Hi, everybody. We're Team 5, made up of Kate, Qingqing, Maryam, Alexi, Jinwen, Hao, and myself, Keiko. And we're going to present our work on international supply chain shocks in a meta-coupled world. And so just to introduce things, this is actually great following the last presentation, because we're going to start by introducing that we are in an increasingly globalized and interconnected world, both socioeconomically and environmentally. And this graphic here is a really good illustration of how we are embedded in a globalized capitalistic economy that can have side effects on the environment, whether or not we realize it or not. It is distant, maybe out of sight, out of mind. And this interconnections, they make things really convenient for us, but it also introduces a lot of risks and vulnerabilities in a complex system like this. And as we're becoming more aware of these risks, there are more efforts to holistically address sustainability from a social, economic, geopolitical, and environmental standpoint. The SDGs from the UN are a good example of this. There's a huge slew of sustainability goals here that are all interconnected in potentially unobvious ways. But when you really get down into it, you can realize that we are all in a meta-coupled system. So there's many ways to think about coupled human natural systems, social ecological systems. Metacoupling is a theoretical framework, and it emphasizes that there are distances and there are linkages across distant space and scales, which is the geographer's languages. So we are focusing specifically on metacoupling and telecoupling, and how activities in one place can have distant interactions and impacts on other places. And again, this is happening within a globalized world, has impacts at different scales too, local, regional, sub-regional, national, all the way to, again, worldwide perspectives. We're focusing on supply chains, and an obvious supply chain sort of shock that illustrates this meta-coupled world that we all might be very top of mind and familiar with is COVID and supply chains, and impacts on very central actors can affect us on a very local scale, can affect us going and getting coffee at our local coffee shop in the morning as prices increase and supply chains are strained. So generally, we came in with this question on how did international trade patterns change during COVID-19? We actually focused on a couple commodities because it turns out we trade a lot of things from country to country. We chose crops and medical supplies because they have very direct relations to environmental and then social well-being outcomes too. Here are just a few of those sustainable development goals that I showed a few slides ago that can directly connect to crops and medical supplies, anything from food security to environmental quality. And our hypotheses were that due to this high interconnectedness globally, COVID was highly disruptive at all scales, globally, regionally, subnationally, et cetera. And by disruptive, we mean that the volume of commodities, crops, and medical supplies changing would change drastically. And then also the partnerships between countries would also change. So we can see this through a geographic and a network analyses that Kate will introduce now.
Okay, so for our analytical approach, we took quite a few different techniques to visualize and to statistically analyze trade networks and trade flows and changes in them over our time period. We, of course, started with data cleaning and pre-processing for the first for the first day and a half. And then we started by visualizing trade flow changes across time in our time period at different scales, intercontinental, intracontinental, and international. And then we moved to statistical analysis to uncover trade networks, which we call trade communities or trade clusters, and looking at how these communities changed over the time period. We used all of our data from the UN Comtrade data set, which is annual international trade volumes by commodity and by country. So we have that data available for 2019 to 2021. And the rest of our results are going to show the results for the medical supply trade. Okay, so this slide is showing an animation of Circos graphs that we created for a few different scales. I'm going to give you like a little hors d'oeuvre platter of our results. Okay, so a little taste. This is our international result for Circos map. And what you should be taking away from this is that Europe dominates trade by volume in dollar amount. So you see the most trade being imported for medical supplies and exported for medical supplies from Europe, that light blue color. But what is interesting about this graph is we see changes relative for the other continents as well. Even a small change in volume showing up on this graph means there was a significant amount of relative change over the time period. So you see an expansion of Asia exporting over this time period medical supplies, which we might interpret as the export of COVID vaccines over this time period. Then we move to our intra-regional analysis. So this is Africa and showing the regions of Africa grouped by UN regional labels. And we see the same thing. We see domination by Southern Africa as importer and exporter, but we see their strongest partners with West Africa, East Africa, and we see major increases in imports in Middle Africa across the time period, as you see the portion of the pie increasing as trade flows in for medical supplies. Then we descriptively plotted our different commodities. So briefly, this is showing again, Africa. We're going to stay on that as our case study for the rest of these results. The columns are showing the different regions, and the different lines on the graphs are showing different imports. So the dashed lines are showing import volumes between the regions across just within the time period. The bottom row is showing medical supplies. So what you're seeing is there's differential changes in volumes geographically within the continent, and this is not accounting for import from intercontinental trade. Okay, then we move to our community detection processes. So across the bottom of this screen, you're seeing network graphs of communities of trade on the continent of Africa. And which countries are trading the most with each other. So the colors of the nodes on the bottom, which represent a country, so each dot is a node, is mapped up on the map that you see above. And what you see across this is that the clusters of trade changed over the time period, where we saw one of our clusters disappear in the year 2020 as they were absorbed by other trade clusters, and then they appeared in 2020 and then were reabsorbed by their original clusters by 2021. And then we see some countries switching. So you see the star on DRC in the middle, switched clusters over time and never returned to its original. Madagascar was very isolated and stayed by itself. The entire time period hasn't changed. We then went further down to country analysis. And so these slides are showing for Egypt, which is a key country for importing globally and within the continent of Africa. So it's a significant trade partner for many countries all over the world and on the continent. And what we're showing is changes in trade flows. The lines are showing the top 6 trading partners in the whole world for both imports and exports. So imports are shown in red and pink, exports are shown in blue. And what you're seeing is that Egypt's trading community for its top importing and exporting partners stayed relatively stable with some minor changes, where you saw the US disappear as a major importing or source of imports. And we saw that most of the exporting countries stayed stable over the time period, which is what we saw for most of our key large players in trade across all of our regions. So the key takeaways in the summary of like what all of these analyses and visualizations are telling you are that trade flows across scales, intercontinental, intracontinental, and international, changed over our time period. Trade communities became more integrated, where we saw those trade clusters become more tightly connected. We saw some split off that might have already been majorly trading, but they became even more closely related in trade during the pandemic. So more integrated, meaning more trade volume, more numbers of trade, more value of trade goods. And then key trade countries experienced changes in their trade flows, but not their trade communities, which has interesting implications for understanding what was happening with trade during that time. For our ethical considerations, we had a long discussion yesterday, and you're seeing some screenshots of our notebook and what we checked as important for ethical data considerations. This data set is not using direct information from individual people, but it is a global data set that can be really generalized. And we were really showing descriptively what was happening during the time period. And we have to be really careful, even though we see patterns and we have hypotheses about what was causing those changes, to not overstate, overgeneralize before we do that causal analysis. So for us, that was the major takeaway with the ethical considerations, and also being careful to state where the data were incomplete that we were using. So we had to think carefully about how to showcase a region like Asia, because a lot of data was missing for India, which is a major player in trade on that continent. And we think that data was appropriately used for our study. It was collected to, analyze trade processes, but we have to be careful when we're going between scales, and that's why we broke out the analyses by different scales, to not transfer something that's happening at the intercontinental level to say this is the causal effect, and we see the same process happening at the intracontinental level, for example. So being really careful about that transferability of the processes that we are noticing. So you saw just a little taste of all the results that we generated for this week, but we have so many. Everyone in the group behind me had taken their own region to analyze, and they all have their own individual results and stories that they were telling. So for the future, we're going to get further into each different commodity, hopefully write up and think more about the results for each of the subregions. We also want to take that next step into trying to understand the causal implications for these changes in trade flows by looking at indicators that have to do with medical and crop supply to things like land use, health outcomes like COVID vaccination rates and COVID deaths, and understanding what was happening because of these changes in trade flows. So again, metacoupling, linking these complex processes that don't play out the same way at same different scales across space. Thank you.